We are back inside City Hall. Of the 400 public high schools in our city, 8 are so-called specialized schools, where admission is based solely on a student score on the Specialized High School Admissions Test. Those schools are traditionally high performance and highly competitive, but there have been complaints that these elite schools do not reflect the ethnic makeup of our city. Currently, just 6% of students in the city's specialized schools are African American, 7% are Latino, while 24% are white and 60% Asian. Those figures stand in sharp contrast to the actual numbers of Black and Latino students in all city high schools, where Blacks make up 28% of the total student body and Latinos 40%. Joining me now to talk about this disparity and some ideas that are being floated about what can be done to change it, we've got Larry Cary, who's president of the Brooklyn Tech Alumni Foundation, and Tom Allon, the CEO and co-owner of City and State, the publication, and also a proud alumnus and former teacher at Stuyvesant High School. Thank you both for joining us. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And Larry, I understand the graduation was actually today. We yanked you out of there to run over here, so thanks very much.
My pleasure.
But let's talk a little bit about what's really going on here. 28,000 students sit for the test. They're competing for 3,800 available seats across the 8 schools. Isn't that the problem right there? I mean, why are we rationing this resource?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry for laughing, but the issue is not rationing a resource. The issue is that these schools select among the very highest achieving students in the city of New York and provide them with a rigorous education that challenges them, and not every kid can go. I mean, it's just that simple. So it's not that we're rationing the resource. In fact, historically, there were only 3 of these schools, and now there are 8.
Well, is there a fundamentally different kind of learning that goes on in this environment that you can't do any other way?
I mean, listen, you have a hothouse of intellectual ideas that goes on when you put kids who are motivated and have, strong educational backgrounds. But there could be a couple of more schools like this. I mean, there's no reason why 8 is the magic number. But fundamentally, when Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and Brooklyn Tech were created, they were really schools that specialized mostly in math and science. And that's really where the emphasis has been. And Nobel Prize winners have come out of these schools, and others, other great scientists, doctors, but obviously there have been some great journalists and others.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're one of them. I mean, look, you'd have succeeded at whatever high school they sent you to. Did you have to be at Stuyvesant in order to?
No, I didn't. I was at a local private school before that, and there are many times I sort of lamented the fact that I didn't stay in a small educational setting, because I remember my first day at Stuyvesant, there was an up and down staircase, which coming from a small private school that had 60 kids in a class kind of shocked me.
Right. Larry, isn't this really about the college placement list in a lot of ways? I mean, what attracts a lot of parents is, hey, if my kid goes to science, if my kid goes to tech, if my kid goes to Stuyvesant, they're sending scads of people to, to Stanford and MIT and Harvard and Princeton.
Well, on some level, you're right. 65% of the students who come from New York City who are admitted to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton come from 3 high schools in the city of New York, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. So on that level, you're correct. But, that's still a small handful of students. We're talking about 15,000 kids in the specialized high schools. So they're not all going to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay.
But they are universally college ready. They are performing. The 8 schools have higher SAT scores than any other school in the city of New York. These 3 schools, with the help of 3 others, produce, I think it's 25% of the college-ready students in the New York City population. These 3 schools are the overwhelming contributors to advanced placement tests. I mean, these schools are superior academic institutions.
Well, I'm going to ask you in a minute about some of the suggestions that you both publicly made about how to change this, but first let's push you a little bit on why there's a need to change anything. I mean, my sense is that there's a sort of a discomfort with the fact that what's supposed to be a public institution and public education has a certain kind of ideology behind it. This is for everybody, and yet you look at it and it seems to be quite sharply divided, somewhat by income but largely by race.
I used to believe that Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and Brooklyn Tech and those schools represented the last true meritocracies in America, because it didn't matter whether you were a Rockefeller or a Chang. If you scored 1 point above the cutoff score, you can get into these schools. The problem is that they've become focused on this one test, and so there are many students who start in 3rd grade and 4th grade preparing just for this test. And what we have now is a entering class every year of great test takers who may not be the most gifted kids in the city or the most intellectually gifted students. And I've heard this from people at Stuyvesant. The English department chairman mentioned to me that the writing skills of students that come to the school in the past decade have suffered. So that's why I'm suggesting that you add a writing component to the exam to at least ensure that the students that are coming in have basic and strong writing skills.
And let me just reemphasize that for viewers who may not have heard or understood the full impact of what you're talking about. There are people who start sending their kids, not just once in a while, every weekend, every summer, for 10 years before they take the test. And now when they take the test, they are so far ahead of where somebody who's maybe gone to a couple of prep sessions is going to be that the result is pretty much understandably ordained.
It's an uneven playing field.
Well, I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, you know, the epithet that these are elite schools is completely mischaracterization of what's going on. These are predominantly working class, poor, middle class schools. They are predominantly the children of immigrants or recent immigrants. And the idea that somehow the middle class or the upper middle class or the rich are attending these schools is completely false. The 50% of the student body of the combined 8 schools is receives free or subsidized lunch, which is a measure of poverty in this society. And if you're talking about income, it's so low, it's nowhere near a middle class income. In my school, Brooklyn Tech, probably 80% of the students, whether they're white, they're black, they're Asian, or they're Hispanic, come from families that are recent immigrants. Just depends on what country they came from. And these are kids who do well on a test, would not do well on multiple criteria that have been suggested for these types of schools. They wouldn't do well on interviews, they don't have community service, they don't do the kinds of things that middle class or upper middle class kids can do in order to get into a
your
school.
alumni association is not suggesting that the test be removed. What do you think should be done if you want to get more kids through this pipeline?
Well, I think one of the problems is the New York City school system, quite honestly. I think the test is a symptom. It's not the problem. It's the symptom of an inadequate education that's provided to predominantly black and Hispanic children in the city of New York. And those disparities of educational achievement emerge in the very early years in first grade and continue on through middle school. Demographically, 85% of the students at these schools come from only 15% of the middle schools in the city of New York.
Sure,
you don't get the kind of education you need in the overwhelming number of middle schools that service the black and Hispanic community to do well on this test.
I think Larry's largely correct, but also these feeder schools, they emphasize from day one that the kids from that school should be trained to get into Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, or Brooklyn Tech. Mm-hmm. And so they have after-school test prep. They have test prep during class. You know, they devote a certain time in 8th grade for kids to be prepped. Prepping kids purely for a test is not a broad education. And that's why I think the test should be radically altered from year to year so that you really can't prepare for it in the way that people are being prepared for it now.
That seems like a pretty logical way to address it.
I mean, I've even heard that some of these cram schools that we talked about, that the kids from those schools after the exam phone into the cram schools and tell questions. They memorize questions so that next year's class will know the questions that are on the exam. And that is an unequal playing field.
Well, that seems fairly dishonest as well. What's the status of legislation? There's legislation floated to sort of add other criteria. We're still trying to figure out what's happening at the end of this session. Are you expecting anything to happen?
My understanding is that the bills that were introduced will not move. Today is about the last day of the session, and I don't think this is going to be an issue in the waning hours. I think it's possible it'll come back in January, but it's not here today.
The legislation is not likely to move, but the mayor could, and the chancellor, who I think both believe there's a problem here, could, certainly with the 5 schools that were added on later after the legislation was passed in 1971, they could experiment with some sort of different criteria or a different exam. And changing the exam, adding a writing section, or changing the exam from year to year doesn't require legislation. That could be done by the mayor or the chancellor.
Okay, and it sounds like the point of attack is actually the middle schools as well. So
Absolutely.
Plenty of food for thought. Thank you so much for coming by today.
Thank you very much.
All
Great
right,
pleasure.
we're going to take a short break now. I'll be back in a minute with a preview of tomorrow night's program. Stay with us.